For over 10 years, we at Climate One have been engaging policymakers, influencers, entrepreneurs, and activists and scientists in broad, respectful, candid conversations about everything climate. Food, energy, water, technology, transportation, housing. We've had huge success bringing together people who think they're on opposite sides of issues. When they sit down and have a candid conversation, they often find common ground and the basis for real solutions. We're emotional beings. Thoughtful, inclusive conversations create the conditions in which the changes we want to see become possible. So I want to hear from you. When you talk about climate, how do you talk about it? More importantly, what do you want to be talking about? With whom? Join the conversation. Even make your own video. Invite your friends to join you. Let's talk climate.
I'm Greg Dalton, host of Climate One from the Commonwealth Club. Thanks for joining us for this live stream discussion of how empowering women can help heal the climate and improve life in many other ways. We'd love to hear from you today, so please share your questions in the comments section of the live stream, or you can tweet them at us using our handle @Climate1. For future Climate One discussions on coronavirus, economic disruption, human behavior, and all things climate, you can sign up for our newsletter at climateone.org. You can also subscribe to our podcast. It drops every Friday and is available wherever you get your pods. A few years ago, I had the honor of taking my daughter, then 13 years old, to hear Malala Yousafzai speak in a jam-packed basketball arena about the importance of educating and empowering girls. It was a truly inspiring experience. In a receiving line backstage afterward, my daughter and a friend had their photo taken with Malala, and I said to her, "What you're doing is very important for the climate." She seemed surprised and her head tilted back as she processed what I said. My sense was she didn't think of herself as a climate person at that time. Malala wasn't really talking about climate. She's starting to do that now, talk about the connection between educating girls and climate. But most people still don't connect those issues. Yet educating girls and empowering women are among the most effective levers for strengthening communities, slowing population growth, which is one of the biggest drivers of surging carbon pollution. But why don't we talk more about that suite of climate solutions? In the program today, we'll explore the gender-climate connection while also discussing migration, power, food insecurity, and climate-smart agriculture. We'll even hear how investing in women can help impede the expansion of Al-Qaeda. To show us the way, I'm honored to welcome three experts. Ertharin Cousin is former executive director of the World Food Program and currently a visiting scholar, the Stanford Center on Food Security and the Environment. Musimbi Kanyoro is former president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, currently chair of the board at the United World Colleges. She's joining us from Nairobi. And Corrine Sanchez is the executive director of Tewa Women United, a grassroots organization in New Mexico. So welcome to you all. Thanks for coming on Climate One. Musimbi, I'd like to begin with you. In December of last year, you went to Antarctica on a group called Homeward Bound with about 100 women involved in science, technology, engineering, medicine, and math. And I'd like to hear about that journey, in particular, how it changed you, it inspired you, and whether you felt a little guilty going there to see the impacts of climate change firsthand in Antarctica.
Thank you, Greg. Delighted to be part of this panel. Indeed, going to Antarctica was quite an experience for me. It was an experience for me because it's so far. I know a lot about the fact that most of the world's water is in the Antarctica. And I knew very well that it was supposed to be covered by snow and ice. So there were facts that I knew, but I didn't know what a personal experience would mean. Traveling with women scientists from many different fields meant that we could learn about the impact of these fields, because the objective of the trip was a scientific expedition to specifically understand and speak about climate change while experiencing some part of the world where we can see something that you can hold on and hope for and say, if we keep our world safe and secure and do not disturb it, this is what it would look like, because part of Antarctica is still really whole. and they can stay whole if.
Hey, Musimbi, I'm sorry. Can you just ask you to just move your mic down a little bit? We're getting some of your breath in the record. Yeah, let's try that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
The Antarctica is quite whole. And so we spend time learning 6 hours every day about climate change in different ways. How does it impact different people, different places, and how can each one of us take the leadership that is needed? I have always been in the leadership of women and advocacy work, and so was already involved in matters of climate change. But what changed me was the ability to be with these women, many of whom were researchers, water managers, engineers from the Heathrow Airport, for example, medical practitioners that treat people not only on their physical health, but also mental health, etc. And really putting together how all of these things come together. And we can speak about climate change from many different possibilities using both data from science as well as the experience of people. Now, the change for me, which is what you asked me to talk about, the change for me was that I was at the intersection of changing from a life of being a full-time advocacy for women in the grant-making area in sexual reproductive health, as I worked with a foundation that worked on that before, and specifically also in the past working with girls. And I was trying to define for myself areas where I might lay a lot more emphasis, and had been working strongly with women who are interested in climate change, like Mary Robinson, for example, and wanted to create a place for myself to be active for climate change. And so that trip changed me. It told me that I can actually change the way of speaking and speak about how climate change has impacted the people in the place where I grew up, because I know it really well. I grew up where the rivers were flowing and we could see the water, and it's a farming area, and the farmers knew what seasons were going on, what seeds to plant and not to plant. And today that is not the case. So I joined many other grassroots women to be able to articulate in a language that people can understand about the impact of climate change and not leave it very far up in
Tell us about that journey, and also if you felt like you were privileged to be there.
Yes, thank you for having me today. And I really want to express gratitude for the women on this panel, and for coming forward. Just our connections in the pre-session was powerful to see that connection to Beijing, and the power of women that came from that. So for me, going to Beijing was an unplanned kind of event. Because of Tewa Women United, my mother and other women in our community who had been engaged in this work while I was away at school and college, they started Tewa Women United when I was which is really has been impacted by colonialism and patriarchy. And to travel to Beijing, and I say this is where my fire for activism and finding my voice and really stepping into that light came as I witnessed thousands and thousands of women coming from all over the globe to just give voice to the concerns of their community. Stories of women that stayed for years and communities that raised money to send 1 or 2 delegates or representatives to that space was empowering. And for me as a young Indigenous woman who heard and understood genocide, the colonial history of our communities, the understanding of what that meant as far as impacts on economics, impacts on our access to health and education, what was taken away from our communities, our languages, and how that was related to environment. So coming from my Tewa community, my Tewa Toa community, it's about the wholeness. It's about the interconnection. It's about understanding what happens across the globe is a direct result of what we're doing here, and what happens there is a direct result of what we're experiencing. And growing up with that knowledge, was hearing the stories and hearing the songs, right? And going to Beijing really was a politicizing moment for me because it expanded my circle. Like I understood that there was these levels of impact that we had, but going and hearing the stories of women that were sharing what was happening, the continued genocide that is happening in this world. People talk about it being over and done, part of history, but when we talk about the connections with our communities in South Africa, when we talk about our communities in the Philippines, the storing of the taking away of seeds of knowledge of that food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, and pushing monocropping and pushing that impact and what we know of how that impacts our climate and where we find ourselves. It was there that I realized that I did have privilege, even though I am a woman of color, even though I'm Indigenous, even though I was young, there was still a lot of privilege that I was gifted with in some ways here in my community. And there was a lot of ways that oppression and racism and classism takes that away and takes our power and our voice. But going there and realizing that though I was a survivor of sexual trauma and violence, that there were women that faced immediate death and murder. And then also realizing, it took Beijing, but realizing that here now in the United States, that there are women and families, Indigenous women, as well as African-American women, our immigrant communities that face that imminent death, right? Because of these different systems and oppressions that are happening. But in Beijing, I saw the power of women being able to come together to really give voice on all levels, political, down to the mothers that were just trying to reclaim breastfeeding and reclaim birthing in their communities. And being able to bring that back to our community here and to really commit to that transformation that I witnessed in the stands, that I witnessed in the small classrooms of women gathering, and knowing that this responsibility lays on my shoulders and also the generations to come. And so when I think about Beijing and I think about the memories, it's the beauty of the song, it's the beauty of the colors, it's the vibrations, and really the heart passion and heart work of women across the globe who are giving voice and continue to give voice to how our Earth Mother is being desecrated, and how our women in our own communities have lost a lot of their power and a lot of their voice because of this sexism and racism and classism and oppression and white supremacy that is rampant across this globe, that strips us of our power and our voice around the decisions of our body. And so for me, Beijing just lit that fire, and it hasn't stopped, and it continues to be that we find the heart, that we find the compassion, even in those darkest times, to make that transformation and the change that we need to.
Thank you for sharing that. Ertharin Cousin, where does your light and fire come from? You're the daughter of a community organizer and a social worker. Where does your light and fire come from? Oh, you're on mute. Yeah.
I smile when I listen to powerful women like Corrine and Musimbi, and hear their passion and voice and share in agreement in so much of their experiences. I was born this way. I've always said there's a book inside me waiting to be written. And the title of it is going to be Born This Way. Growing as the oldest child of as you note, a social worker and a community organizer, and I often say before Barack Obama made it popular. At an early age, it was important to my parents that their daughters understand that though we lived in the inner city of Chicago, we grew up in a community called Lawndale, which is on the west side of the city of Chicago, and lots of books have been written about the challenges of this community, that we were blessed with two parents who had the ability to educate us and to give us an understanding that we were in the community, but not of the challenges of that community. And so they often drove us to communities where people had more and communities where people had a lot less. To help us understand what disparities meant in real terms to real people, and to give us a sense of responsibility for not just self and family and community, but ultimately that grew into responsibility for nation, and as my experiences progress, to global community. And recognizing that we have both the opportunity to and the circumstances that demand that we all work together to ensure that we can provide for the sharing of prosperity across racial lines, gender lines, and color lines. And that does not come unless each one of us accepts that responsibility.
Thank you. Musimbi, I'd like to go to you, and can you say something? We just want to test your mic there. You're on mute, Musimbi, but if you can, there you go. Yeah.
Yes.
Can we just test your mic? Just say something, because I want to make sure that mic placement works.
This work really is inspired by women and young people.
Great. Thank you. I think that works, Arnav. So Musimbi Kanyoro, when many people hear climate change, they think of a polar bear, maybe a coal-fired power plant, maybe a solar panel. They don't think of a woman carrying water or a woman in general. So help us understand the connection between climate and women's issues, women's education, and women's empowerment.
Those associations with the, say, polar bears not being able to have a place to be comfortable are relevant, and they are important, or us retaining a global warming of 1.5 degrees is good scientific knowledge. But indeed, they are difficult for most, shall I say, normal people to understand and associate with. They are not wrong, they are just difficult. And sometimes they do not help people to engage. Those of us that are working now in the area of climate change have begun to use a frame of climate justice. And when we use the word climate justice, the really focus is to try to think about the people that are impacted by the climate change, so that we can be able to tell the story in such a way that people can actually associate it with something that they can identify with. So, for example, there are rains and floods going on right now as I speak to you in my own country. People's houses have been swept away. A woman who was on the media yesterday talking about her family talked about the fact that she was a farmer woman, and in their farm, they had all the harvest was ready for being harvested, and some of it sold, some of it used in the family, and it was all swept away. So she has no house to go back to. She has no food. She has no income. And then she showed her two children, small children, who are likely to be probably affected by pneumonia or bilharzia or any of the other waterborne diseases and cold diseases. And then we are at the time of the COVID-19 as well. These people, these communities could not talk anymore about distancing themselves, distancing themselves from each other. They could not talk about wearing masks. They could not talk about anything that we have in place about cleaning their hands, because the water flows that are coming out of the floods are no longer clean water to clean their hands. All of that was swept away. Now, if you link that, what has happened in that place, to what has been happening in regards to climate change, that these droughts, these floods, their impact on people and their impact on communities and the vulnerability of those communities that are poor. And specifically, this woman, whose name I will give as Maria, felt, and you saw her speak for herself, you really see that there is something completely amiss if we don't think of her as a person. and look for a way in which justice can be given to her. Attention on health, attention on, because when things like climate change happen, the impact on there is a difference on how, or they impact people differently. Those who are vulnerable already, like poor, those who are women, those who are children, those who have disabilities, suffer in ways that are different from people who can mitigate these changes by themselves. And so when we talk about climate justice, we want to be able to help people focus on people and know that if we have to mitigate the kind of change that will make a difference, we have to actually look at inequalities that Ertharin and Corrine talked about. These inequalities make people experience vulnerabilities in different ways. And until we deal with those inequalities, our words will address only those that have possibilities to do something about it. And there are others who cannot do something about it. And so finally, I want to say that there are ways that we can talk about climate change by bringing it closer to the experiences of people, but also we can tell stories in different ways. We can tell stories in films, we can tell stories in podcasts, we can tell stories by bringing actually the actual people that have been impacted to tell their own story, and that is the loudest and the best way in talking about climate change, so that the scientists can be able to take this language of people and make it into a language that will engage people's emotions as well as people's intellectual thinking as well.
Ertharin Cousin,
learn to speak, people will have to speak for them.
Ertharin Cousin, you've traveled a lot and talked to a lot of women, and as the former head of the World Food Program, what are some of the stories that you've seen that powerfully connect women's empowerment with climate resilience and climate justice along the lines Musimbi just mentioned?
I was listening to Musimbi and nodding my head, yes, 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 because her articulation of the experiences that my travels have given me just provide more evidence of where the anecdotes that I can bring to you are based upon the experiences, not just of the women I saw, but women around the world. For example, when I was in South Sudan, after it became South Sudan, and we were meeting with women in the fields who had migrated back from Sudan after that war, and we could talk a great deal about the conflict ongoing in South Sudan, but let's just talk about that period of time when there was hope and women were given equal access to the seeds, to the tools, to the financial support, as well as to the training that was necessary for them to plant and grow maize. They were so proud to have the ability to grow a crop with other women in their cooperative that for the first time gave them financial resources, which gave them voice in their households that they did not previously have, because they were able to bring money into the house. And they were able to their collective efforts to support the school fees that were necessary for their children, as well as addressing their own empowerment, as we like to say. And the women said to me, this was the first time that they felt listened to. But what we know is that the effects of climate change result in more erratic rains. And that same woman and her cooperative, who has the access to finances because she can grow a harvest, we've seen in subsequent periods no longer having the ability to have the resources that they need and being forced to stand in a line. And what my experiences tell me is that when we give women equal access to the training, to the tools, to the finances, that they will grow the food that is necessary to avoid their need to stand in those lines. But that means that we need more climate resistant, we need more drought resistant seeds. We need more research into agriculture that is smarter, that will ensure that when the rains affect the ability of the crops to grow, that we have early warning systems that provide for the type of changes that are necessary, that continue to ensure the ability of that woman, her community, to have the opportunity to provide for both her food security and the economic security of her family. I have never in all my training, all of my work, met a family who wanted to stand in a line for food. Everyone wants to feed their own children. But when the circumstances don't allow them the access to that opportunity, it requires that we provide the provision of assistance that is necessary. And so we know, and I'll just say this to so we can move on, but we know that the projections of a population are to 9.5 to 10 billion people by 2050, which means that we need to increase production of food by some 50% by 2050. We also know that women are the agriculture laborers that between 40 and 70%, for an average of 43%, 70% in some other countries. And we know that despite that, significant percentage of women in the agriculture system, that they don't have equal access to, as I said, the tools, the finances, the training that is necessary for them to produce the harvests that are required in a climate affected world. What that means then is that we can't solve the growing need for food access unless we equally invest in those women.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about women's empowerment and climate change at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Ertharin Cousin, former executive director of the World Food Program, Musimbi Kanyoro, former president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, and Corrine Sanchez, executive director of Tewa Women United, a grassroots civil rights organization in New Mexico. I'd like to talk. Evelyn Ajwang is a nurse and midwife who also teaches family planning and reproductive health in small towns and villages in Kenya. We asked her about the obstacles faced by the women she works with.
Women in Kenya normally are not mostly economically empowered, so they depend mostly on men in terms of their livelihoods. So even whatever the woman would want to do, she has to get permission from the husband. So this would be a challenge mostly in terms of decisions on matters reproductive health. The husband has to agree with whatever she wants to do. And then the issues of myths and misconceptions surrounding reproductive health and family planning. For example, that when a woman is using family planning, either this woman will become infertile in future, which is not true, it's a myth. When you use family planning, You can deliver an infant with the malformation. These are myths that are going around within the community that is affecting uptake among women of reproductive age. We realized that men were not well conversant with issues of contraceptives and also family planning. They were very green and ignorant. So what we did is we targeted men with information. Then they were realizing, hey, if we plan our families, then the health of this woman will be better. And also we are telling them that when you have a larger family, your economic status is also not stable. The challenges on population, health, and environment are integrated. There's no way one can ever separate the three. Because with a larger population, meaning lesser resources available to these communities, then these people will be using the available natural resources. The resources keep on depleting. There are some communities that don't allow women to plant trees. They were saying that when the women plant trees, then that would be a taboo. That community will be cursed and will be affected for a longer duration in terms of either deaths or them not receiving rainfall. When you empower a woman, you empower a whole community. Because when you give knowledge to this woman, and this is something that is factual, we've seen it, this woman is able to deliver this information to the whole community, and this thing will spread.
Greg, you're muted.
Thank you. That was Evelina Zhuang, a nurse and midwife in Kenya. She manages a maternal, neonatal, child health, and family planning program for Pathfinder International. That was in Kenya, and Musimbi's in Kenya. But I want to ask Corrine, as Americans listening to this might think, oh, these are issues or challenges for women in countries that I don't know where they are on a map, and I'm probably not going to go there. How do you see some of those issues as relevant to the communities you work with in New Mexico in the United States? Corrine?
Yes. We've been involved in reproductive justice issues, I think, since the beginning of the organization in 1989. There's no way that we as women cannot be involved in reproductive justice issues because it involves our bodies and our choices, and the long-term productivity or reproductive ability of our communities. And so I come from this in many different angles of thinking about contraceptives and thinking about reproductive health and thinking about a lot of different challenges that our communities face. And as communities that have had a targeted genocidal strategies against our communities, right? When colonialism happened, rape and assault and murder of our children and our women were a part of that strategy. It still continues to be a part of the military strategies across the world, to wipe out communities, to take away their cultural sense of being, their mother tongues, and that knowledge that I just heard my sister speak about around corn and fields and the memories of our seeds. So when we talk about this memory of seeds, not only those that we plant in the ground, but those that we carry as women, the memory of those seeds continues to be things that we need to nurture and things that are influenced by the social, economic surroundings of all of us, our societies and our communities. We talk about that in particular because of historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and individual complex trauma that we know passes through generations and passes through seeds as well. So my sister was talking about maize and corn and drought-resistant seeds. And we know as communities that grow up in these environments where they are challenged by different seasonal fluxes, rains, droughts, that our seeds learn this. Our seeds are remembering. And so those seed resistant and drought resistant seeds exist And those have been taken away from communities like the Philippines, like Africa, where people wanted to give monocropping, right? Give certain seeds that don't germinate after just one cycle. They're not fertile after that. We have corn sizes and varieties that come from all across the world that are tiny, that are really, drought resistant to those, we see big yellow corn. But that diversity helped to sustain all of our communities across the globe. And when we talk about reproductive justice and needing to nurture the seeds of our women, research has shown us that women carry the seeds of their grandchildren, right, already in that in our being. And so when we talk about the impact on generations because of climate change, because of other contaminations that may come to our communities, and as I speak one as a Tewa woman from my community that at one point in history was down to 100 people. And in this time of COVID, I know across the world, people have heard how Indigenous communities here in the United States are threatened by COVID, right? Smallpox wiped out large populations of our communities, so that biogenetic warfare has continued to occur. And as we don't understand the impacts that climate change, that different floods, that different things that in this web continue to be, we don't know what other non-living viral microbial, what we call relatives, creatures, whatever you want to term it, exist and how those come into being. And so as a community that has seen that impact of reproduction, we also had forced sterilization of Native women in our communities. We've also had the practice of people bringing in contraceptives and practice and testing those in our communities. So I know that there's this upside and there's also this dark history that we really need to understand when we talk about long-term contraceptives and hormones and all of that impact on our reproductive health. And when we talk about the power and voice of women to choose. And I agree that as we become more educated and we have this medically accurate information, this exists in our Acting Healthy Sexuality Body Sovereignty project that we've been implementing in our communities. As we give people medically accurate information, we trust that they're going to make the decisions that best support them and their families. We've also been the subject as Indigenous peoples across the globe, in the United States in particular, of religious inquisitions from different religious groups that are saying that they have the right. This goes back to the doctrine of discovery. This goes back to manifest destiny, where they have the right to determine for other peoples what they should and shouldn't be doing, or if they're deemed human or not human. So I don't want to say lightly that reproductive issues are, just this, and this. They are about understanding that complex history and understanding the impositions of other people's religions and beliefs on other peoples. And how do we recognize the humanness and the humanity of all of us? And I want to go back to where we're at in this country of the United States, this colonial space, where African-American babies are being murdered, not just in the womb, but as individuals throughout their lifetime. That our children, women of color, people of color's children are being murdered because they're being seen as different. And that is a reproductive justice issue, not just the contraceptives, not just the population control, but really understanding that history of how people have used domination over others to implement political policies and strategies that have erased populations, that displace people. And so how can we come to this place where I believe that women have a heartfelt, different way of women knowingness to implement policy and change. And we see that at this time in COVID in those countries that are ruled by women, that have had women placed in those political positions. I've also seen women that are in political positions that also abuse power and do not hear and listen to community. So I don't want to say it's also just this gendered piece, but we really need to understand in our communities the patriarchy and the patriarchal system, just what that video highlighted for us, the beliefs that come in when people believe that they have dominion over others, and how do we talk about transforming that power dynamic in our individual households to our systemic societal levels. How do we have those deep conversations? And I want to go back to, for me, that started in Beijing. That for me, that started that plant and seed growing, so that we can now have in our organization and in our communities these conversations about engaging men and boys in the violence that's committed against women and girls, because most of that violence is coming from men and boys. And so healthy masculinity, and how do we talk about that? How do we talk about toxic masculinity? I think those are all pieces of that reproductive justice that needs to continue. Sorry.
Musimbi, you have a doctorate in feminist theology, a doctorate in feminist theology. Does addressing climate change mean sort of attacking patriarchy, some of the deep-rooted systems? We often talk about climate change as solar and wind and types of energy and power. Is there a different type of power, gendered power, male power and dominance that Corrine just talked about? Should that be part of the climate conversation?
Yes, it should be. Talking about any feminist, whether they are coming on it to it from a social perspective, from a secular, from a theological perspective, etc., really talks about justice. And one way for us to be able to ensure justice for women is to be able to address patriarchy, because we are all victims of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system, and it's a system that gave privilege to male persons and underprivileged the female persons. We as women and men are all victims of it, and we need to be able to speak out against it, to be angry about it, and to find ways in which we can be able to right what is wrong in regards to equality. And I think many people are working on this from many aspects of their lives. And in climate change, as well as in the areas of sexual reproductive health, we cannot be able to get to the right answers without also addressing patriarchy. I do want to say some things that can be also confusing, which Corrine has talked about, and I agree with everything that she has said about misusing women's bodies from outside without them having their own voice to decide on what is best for them. It's a difficult area, but when we think of sexual reproductive health for women, we think of it in terms of many different directions. I have learned by working for many years with Global Fund for Women, working with other organizations that address women, etc., that the health issue for women is important. If we are able to say, for example, in Africa, we say that 89% of all women are in the informal sector supporting the most important aspect, food on the table, kids, etc. And if we are able to say things like 80% of farmers in Africa are women, how are they going to be able to run their work if every year, every 9 months, they have another child? It impacts on their health, their ability to be able to work. Women spend on the continent of Africa, for example, 40 hours a week on just fetching water alone before they even do the other jobs that they have to do. So when we talk about making accessibility reproductive health for women, we want women to be safe and to be healthy. And this covers many ways. It may cover family planning, which might be about spacing kids or deciding when a woman wants to have a child and with whom, so that it's not forced. It might be about pre or postnatal health. It might be about contraception. It might be about having access to safe abortion. It might be about ability to get the information, age-appropriate information at the right time. Currently, I just want to say I'm very inspired by the courage of young people, because young people are able to see quite a lot of how these things are interconnected. And I think that we should invest in women and the leadership of women to be able to get the differences that my sisters on the panel have talked about. But we should also invest in young people and in the education of young people. And I see through the colleges that we work within the United World Colleges, many young people are really providing leadership in these areas. And because they come to these areas without the stigmatization and patriarchy, without being extremely rooted in patriarchy in the way in which older generations have been rooted in, they really can be a future that opens up some place that we could go to that is a better place than where we are today.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about women's issues at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Ertharin Cousin, former executive director of the World Food Program, Musimbi Kanyoro, former president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, and Corrine Sanchez, executive director of Tewa Women United, a grassroots civil rights organization in New Mexico. We're going to go to our lightning round. We'll ask a quick association of our guests. I'll mention person, place, or thing, and ask for their first response from their heart, off the top of their mind, unfiltered. First with Corrine Sanchez, what comes to mind when I say seed sovereignty?
I think of my grandmothers and all the lineage of women that I come from.
Musimbi Kanyoro, what comes to mind when I say pedophile priests?
What comes into mind is the abuse of the power that religious people have. They have the power, the trust of the people, and abusing that power in misusing and abusing children.
Thank you. Ertharin Cousins, what comes to mind when I mention ugly produce?
The opportunity to eliminate waste, of which about 40% of all the food that we produce around the world is lost or wasted, and much of it because we have these preconceived notions about how food should look. And as such, we dispose of perfectly good food. So the opportunity to ensure no child goes hungry by us overcoming misconceptions about what food is good and eliminating that waste.
Corrine Sanchez, what's one phrase or word that comes to mind when I say the new members of Congress elected in 2018?
AOC, women power.
Also for Corrine Sanchez, one word or phrase that comes to mind when I say Black Lives Matter.
All my sisters and friends at Sister Song.
This is true or false. Musimbi Kanyoro, true or false. Inheritance laws discriminate against women in 26 countries.
It's false because there are more countries than that.
Also for Musimbi, true or false. Climate smart agriculture is a Trojan horse for Monsanto and other big corporations.
False, and I can substantiate why.
Okay, we'll circle back to that, the power of seeds and concentration. True or false, Corrine Sanchez, American capitalism was built on stolen land and stolen labor.
True, true, true.
Ertharin Cousin, true or false, the science is clear that GMO foods are safe for humans to eat.
I'd say true. The science is clear, and we are too often driven by misconceptions.
Is it also for Ertharin? Is it also true that GMOs foster industrial monoculture and high concentration of economic power?
Is it true? No, I say it's false, because the GMOs provide an opportunity for monoculturing, but we have a need for diversity in agriculture, and GMOs are just one of the tools that we should use to meet the needs of a growing population.
We'll come back to that. Musimbi Kanyoro, true or false? Some women enable patriarchy.
True.
Also for Musimbi, I have benefited from white privilege more than I realize.
True.
Corrine Sanchez, I've been shaped by patriarchy so much that it's hard for me to see.
True.
Ertharin Cousin, as a talk show host, I should not ask women about gender issues unless I also ask men about gender.
True.
All right, that ends our lightning round. I made that mistake earlier this week, and my female producers schooled me on that. So thanks for that lightning round, Corrine. Ertharin Cousin, let's come to the concentration of power, because we've heard from Corrine about the importance of seeds, and we've heard about, you mentioned how much food production needs to increase to meet the demand of 9 or 10 billion people on this planet. And industrial monoculture is one way that some people would say that food demand can be met. And I'm curious to hear whether that industrial monoculture is compatible with empowering women in the way that we've been talking about, or if that, concentrates power in corporations in a very more concentrated way.
Increasing global food production by 50% to feed that 9.5 to 10 billion people require diversity of solutions. And those solutions must include the 43 to 70% of women who participate in agricultural production. And that will include their participation in the existing systems of today, in organic production, in more biological and technological production that we'll see in the future. There should not be a solution that is sustainable, both from an environmental as well as a social standpoint, that we exclude, to ensure that we meet the opportunities for empowering all, both men and women, and feeding all on a regular basis, the nutritious food that is necessary to support the adequacy of our lives.
I'm interested, Musimbi, how you see, GMOs and industrial scale monoculture. Are those in conflict at all with empowering women in agriculture?
I have been at two sides of this debate over the years. And I think that I had the biggest change when there was a large famine in Ethiopia. And I went to Ethiopia for work, and the GMOs were, and other different ways, seeds and so on, and quick growing foods were being encouraged so that people would be able to survive from famine. And I found that all of the words that I used to have to condemn the GMO were done just from a safe place, when you are not there in the middle of famine. And I changed my mind. I changed my mind to say, we must do our best to ensure that any traditional farming, foods, seeds, etc., are not neglected in favor of only GMOs or other kinds of farming. But we must know that there is a place sometimes, and for all of these other possibilities, scientifically grown foods. I changed my mind in the middle of a famine, because I saw what death looks like.
Yeah.
Right. It's the reality. When you've sat with people who benefit from science, you know that there is a place for science that will provide the access to the necessary food. It should not be to the destruction of natural crops, historical crops, the ability of farmers to access the traditional seeds and to grow traditional seeds. We need a diversity of solutions.
Ertharin, climate disruption is hitting food production in many ways. Droughts and floods are impacting harvest, growing areas are changing, and pests are on the move. One particularly dramatic and devastating example is swarms of desert locusts that are ravaging crops in parts of Africa and Asia, threatening food supplies for tens of millions of people. You could say what's happening and what's at stake with these swarms of locusts?
And Musimba's sitting there.
Musimbi, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She may be better placed because she's living with it right now than even I am. We know that this is not the first time that locusts have affected agriculture in Eastern Africa. But it is it's one of the largest swarms that we've seen. And we also know that if we had invested last year in the eradication of the locust population, we would not be facing the challenges that we see today. Let me just put this into terms. A locust swarm in a field can consume the same amount in one day that 35,000 people would eat.
Wow.
One day. And we know that in June or July, the locust swarms in Eastern Africa will begin to hatch and grow. And what COVID-19 has done has limited the access to the tools that are necessary to eradicate the locust swarms. But I've been delighted to see over just the last few weeks an increase in access to those tools by the governments of Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, that are now just beginning the work that is necessary to eradicate. But I'd love to hear from Musimbi,
Musimbi, you want to get
Musimbi, I'm so sorry. To Musimbi, who is even closer to the actual ongoing activities.
The devastation is terrible. In the areas where the locusts have come, and they have been in Eastern Africa all the way from Somali and arrived in Kenya, and we don't know, and in Uganda, and some parts of Uganda as well. And they really already defined that they will be famine because they eat everything. And they have been in places which produce a lot of agricultural products, but they eat anything, including grass, anything that grows, they eat everything. This is why I think paying attention to science and thinking in advance can be helpful. But I don't think that I could be able to blame all of these governments that they did not take science into account, etc. There are investments that are required long in advance, and also many of these governments have got so many things that they have to pay attention to. For example, right now, even though the locusts are really a big problem, the focus on COVID-19 by these governments is just so urgent and so pressing that you don't even hear much about locusts in the media anymore. We know that something is happening, but you don't hear as much as you hear on COVID-19. And so there are just quite a lot of things that people have to pay attention to. But this is, yes, go ahead.
COVID is pushing so many things to the side. Ertharin Cousin, I mentioned earlier that there's a connection between investing in women and the recruitment of Al-Qaeda. Can you connect those dots for us?
Well, we know that when there is food insecurity, when agricultural production detrimentally impacts households, and particularly women-headed households where sons believe they have responsibility for meeting the needs of their family, they become ripe recruits for Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations like ISIS. We are seeing this impact now in the Sahel, for example, where ISIS and Al-Qaeda related groups that have now infiltrated into Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, are now working to recruit the sons of in families where they provide food and as an incentive for those boys, those young men, to join their organizations. And that is being exacerbated by COVID-19 now, because of the lack of access to food makes these young men even more vulnerable to the attraction of those who would provide the access to the food that the family needs. And so it is, and what climate and now COVID-19 are doing is exacerbating the challenges of poverty and low and low human development in households that are in areas that have been infiltrated by terrorist groups and organizations, to making those young men vulnerable to the appeal of these groups. And so we know that the investment in agriculture, the investment in food security, the investment in economic opportunity provides a stability in a household, and ultimately the stability in a community that limits the attraction of terrorist organizations.
Thanks if you're just joining us. We're talking about women's empowerment and climate change at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Corrine Sanchez, Ertharin Cousin, and Musimbi Kanyoro. Corrine Sanchez, you shared earlier. Appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing. You some very painful personal experiences with childhood abuse, and a lot of activism is fueled by anger, and yet you've chosen love and transformation over anger. So can you tell me about how you've overcome your anger in relation to your motivation for activism?
I think my anger is still there. I don't think I feed it as much. I think I'm anger and trauma can like close in your mind to see the possibilities, and understand, getting to the cause, instead of it just being individual, to really understand the systemic causes of those violences. And I want to speak to, the economic piece, right? We know that if any human has all that they need to care for their well-being, the dangers of all these drugs and other things get limited. You're not going to go for that if you're well fed, well taken care of. You have that caring, loving attachment and bonding with your family and your community. And so those are really key points for us. And understanding like the personal violence that happened to me is related to the colonial history that continues to happen and exist for women across this globe, and that patriarchy and that white supremacy. And so I feel like I've come to the place, because of the women in our organization, because of this grounding in spirituality and the connection to wholeness and well-being, to really, and also being inspired by those leaders that I feel across the globe that have faced the most horrendous violations and abuse, have come to that place of seeing the love in their perpetrators, in their violators, and wanting to hold that peace, because we know that an eye for an eye will make all of us blind, and that's not necessarily the route that we want to go. It's how do we understand and transform in these moments, that darkness to light. And so I feel I've had some really good mentors and role models in women and men in my community and across the globe, that I feel give out that nurturing leadership, that leadership that understands that we are connected to one another, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of where we live, regardless of our class, regardless of our educational levels, that we are all connected to one another. And so I continue to get inspiration from that. I know that the continued well-being of my community doesn't just exist in the Tewa people here in my area, that it's connected across the globe to all of our communities. And that light and love, I know seems like fluff, right? But there's a lot of this places around we're trying to shift behavior with COVID and mask wearing, that we're really looking at the love for ourselves and the love for others, in order to understand and move that. But it also takes action, right? It takes the action, and love is just that energy. It's the same as anger and hate. It's an energy. So if we're feeding more of that positive energy across the world, I feel like we're going to make some huge transformations. And right now in this moment, we have that opportunity to think about the biodiversity, the diversity across economic systems, across our world, across gender, across class. We need that diversity in order to have a healthy system. There is no way that we can just be one dominant way over all the others. And I feel like for myself, the compassionate leadership and the empathetic leadership that I'm seeing rising up in communities is driven by that. But I also want to say that the anger is still there. I still get riled up. For me, that anger comes out. I think a misinterpretation for people in feelings is also that women are more, that we cry more. I think that's our anger turns inside out, right? And so instead of lashing out, there's this way that it comes to be released. And we need to honor all of those different perspectives. And I like to say this right just here, that in my growing up and maturing, that I've really thanked anger for getting me through the darkest times of my life, and helping me to survive. And that there is now a time and place that I need to put that type of outburst anger aside, and that I need to incorporate a more open perspective, a more holistic perspective, a more broader perspective. And I feel like healing justice in all the work that we're doing around economics, around gender issues, around reproductive justice issues, that we really need to embrace healing justice in those platforms around what justice is, so that we go through these and we don't end up in that healing where we were before, but we take those lessons and we end up in a different space that I hope is integrating a lot of what we're learning, and bringing that forward in a transformative place for our young people. Because like my sister, I believe that young people are the place that we need to do this investment in order to transform and continue this transformation in our world. And I just want to say that I'm grateful for all of you here, the knowledge that was shared on this panel. It just inspires me and gives me more perspective in moving forward in this work. And I'm really great. I also want to give a shout out because we have a World College here in New Mexico, and the students have come to our organization and have volunteered their time to learn about our community, to give back into our gardens. We have a Healing Food Oasis garden. We also have a doula program. And so all of these things we know are the interconnection to the revival of midwifery and that knowledge in our communities. And I'm just really grateful for the women and men who have helped to shape me, and also the political movements that have helped to shape me. Thank you.
Thank you. Musimbi, you've worked in some, based in Silicon Valley. Now you're in Nairobi. The world seems to be turning inward these days with COVID. We're kind of sheltering, thinking about me here now. We hear a lot about community. We're talking about, women's communities around the world. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how, is community strengthening now? Because it seems to me the world's going the other direction. We're kind of sheltering because of COVID and what's happening in the politics of the United States.
Yeah, I'm observing, and we who don't live in the USA right now are also quite keen to see what is happening, because you're really out in a pedestal. Everybody can see what is happening in the USA. I see it right from here in my room, in our sitting room here. We see what is happening, and sometimes wonder. But and that aside, I think that there are three areas that I worry about COVID. One is that we had grown in the world a very strong globalization, and sought globalization as something that is good. So for example, in our United World Colleges, the reason that we bring students from every part of the world to study together in a particular college is so that we can be able to overcome the fear of differences and see that we are all human together, and we can achieve a lot as human together. COVID has in some ways destabilized some of that, because we had to hide quite quickly, get into our geographical places, and even not just stay in your geographical place, but inside your house and stay locked in. And we don't know what that is going to do to us. But at the same time, let me show the other aspect of it. There are a lot of webinars that are going on. I'm part of, and I have listened to and sat into webinars. And people that used to convene 50 people are now convening 500 people, which means that we are actually hearing each other in larger forums than we did before. And that is really important. And we might also learn together that some of the behaviors that we have embraced over time, for example, behaviors of destroying the environment by just too much travel, putting resources that we have for ourselves, getting on and doing something, just a few people, we might realize that we could use some of those resources in different ways. Here we are talking and having this conversation while seated in our own houses. We couldn't do that before. We would come to a studio where you are so that you could be able to get better quality of voice, etc., at the expense of each one of us getting into a car, driving to you, or on a plane, sometimes for only 15 or 30 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days, at most 3 days meetings. So there's something that we are going to learn about what we could do together. There's also, we have to guard against thinking, like in the area of developing vaccines, thinking that it matters who does it first. It matters that we do it. And I think what COVID should be teaching us that the more collaboration that we have, and climate work requires collaboration, and collaboration, because it does not affect just one place. We are one world. And COVID might show us that indeed we are one world, because we see what is happening to nature, what is happening to fishes in the sea, and to animals and to birds. They are having some freedom because we have got this one world. And lastly, I want to say that the other aspect of it that is important is for us to realize that when the COVID is over and we get, no, it's not, it might not be over. We might learn to live with it, or it might be over in different ways. But when we get a vaccine, where many people need to get this vaccine, we have to see that COVID has already shone light on the fact that the most disadvantaged ones are even more disadvantaged in the impact of COVID on their lives. We've seen in the USA, we hear of the African American communities on our continents that are so-called developing countries. You will see that we don't have infrastructure that will be able to help us mitigate as much as some of the other places. So when a vaccine is available, to be human, we have to say everybody needs these vaccines, and not privilege those people that have resources for the vaccines, because that is not a way to go forward into the future if we have to be one humanity together.
We are getting close to the end. I want to get in a couple of quick questions from our people watching the live stream. This is for Ertharin Cousin from Alice on YouTube. What challenges and opportunities do American women have to engage with climate change activism? Briefly, Ertharin.
American women are uniquely placed, just as Musimbi was just saying, to the communication tools that advantage our ability to connect with women around the world. Our biggest challenge as American women is seeing ourselves as the center of the problem rather than part of a global humanity that requires the participation of women from around the world. And so as American women, our challenge is to overcome our natural instincts as Americans to think that the solutions must be invented here, because the solutions for women will be invented by women and brought forward by women from across the global community, and we all need to embrace them, whether they came from women leaders here or from women leaders in other parts of the world.
Another question from Barbara on Facebook. If governments were to ask their citizens to help by considering having smaller families, would that offer some new perspective to break the historical oppression that some women have experienced? That's Barbara about smaller families breaking the historical oppression that some women have experienced. Corrine or Musimbi? Corrine?
Corrine.
Okay. I think it's much more complex than that. Would the government asking me to do this when the government has implemented a lot of violences against us as Indigenous women? I find that as a challenge. I think our government should give us all access to universal health care, to access to contraceptives for free, all of these things. And then I think that women will make the decisions that best are in support of them. which in reality, when you look at it, when we're well supported, we're making the decisions to not have children. We're making the decisions to look at our budgets and our economies and think about that. So I think when you give women access to all of the information and the tools that they need, that you're going to see that it does impact population in the ways that being forced to or being imposed to may or may not show. And I say that I also know that this is a challenge in COVID too, because we're asking people to wear masks. The government is asking us, right? Because we know that it helps slow the virus, it helps slow the spread, and we're also pushing back against that as a liberty, right? As a right. Like, why would they tell us to do this? So I think we need to think about this in all of those aspects. And if our government was really a loving and caring and supportive and empathetic government and was teaching that as a core value from the top down, that we would have a very different response and a different way coming from us as opposed to shouting individual rights. I come from a communal place here in my community, and our governments have had us locked down and have us have these other things. But I also know that my government, in a lot of different ways, my tribal government is very communal, and that we understand that this is a responsibility that we have to one another and not just to that governmental structure. And so I think we need to teach this, in different aspects of what that means to be loving, caring, and responsible for one another in our approaches.
We're at the end of our time. On Climate One today, we've been discussing how educating girls and empowering women is one of the best tools for healing the climate that supports all of our lifestyles and economy. We discuss power dynamics between men and women, the connection between environmental justice and gender justice, and investing in women-led households to build community resilience in the face of volatile water supplies and food insecurity. I'm Greg Dalton, and my guests for today were Ertharin Cousin, former executive director of the World Food Program and currently a visiting scholar, the Stanford Center on Food Security and the Environment. Musimbi Kanyoro, former president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, current chair of the board of United World Colleges, joining us from Nairobi, and Corrine Sanchez, executive director of Tewa. Am I saying that right? Tewa?
It's Tewa Women United.
Corrine Sanchez, executive director of Tewa Women United, a grassroots civil rights organization in New Mexico. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. It really does help. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.